Today we're going to talk about the neurology of the mind. I'm just going to give you the high points and we'll expand on these, over the course of the semester. Remember, we're working with a biological model, so we're going to be focusing on causes. What do we believe causes behavior problems? How might we assess it? And what can we do to prevent and treat problems? So let's just look at some vocabulary. We're going to start by looking at the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then we're going to look some at the autonomic nervous system, which is a branch of the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system includes two different parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So remember, the brain is part of the central nervous system, and we're going to focus on several parts this semester. Right now you have a cortical view, so the outside of the brain, and you're looking actually at the left hemisphere, so the left half of the brain. The frontal lobe is in the front of the brain, and it is involved in executive planning, organization, in controlling impulses, and its loss of this tissue seems to be related to dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disorder. Another kind of dementia that we sometimes see occurs after a stroke, particularly one affecting the temporal lobe. So a stroke that affects the temporal lobe often is associated with paralysis, or particularly paralysis on one side of the body, as well as a loss of speech or interruption with speech. And you see that there are parts of the brain, precentral lobe gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, that are involved with those. In terms of assessing what's going on, psychologists don't use MRIs and PET scans except in terms of measuring, or actually, for research purposes. However, they help us to understand what's going on. In this particular case, we see a boy with autism and one without autism. The boy with autism has a smaller cerebellum, and so we are wondering whether there is a possibility or whether the cerebellum seems to be involved with autism. You can also see some of the structural problems in this MRI, or a pair of MRIs, from a pair of twins, one with schizophrenia and one with not. And remember, we said that while there seems to be a pretty strong genetic component associated with schizophrenia, that your chance of getting schizophrenia if your identical twin has schizophrenia is about 48%. And what you see here in the twin with schizophrenia is enlarged ventricles. Those are the black spaces in the red oval. And those ventricles are enlarged, we believe, because of loss of neuronal tissue in the brain. And so as the tissue is lost, the spaces can become larger. We also know something about what's happening with schizophrenia when we're looking at PET scans. So these are a pair of PET scans, one for someone with schizophrenia on the right, and one for someone with schizophrenia or without schizophrenia on the left. And you see that there is less activity in the brain of the person with schizophrenia, particularly in the temporal lobes and in the frontal lobe, each of which is indicated by a black circle or oval. I said we'd talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which really are important when we're talking about anxiety disorders. So the sympathetic nervous system is primarily active when we're thinking about someone who is physically active. If you were to run up and down the stairs right now, your sympathetic nervous system would be much more active. If you are anxious or if you are afraid. And in each of these situations, your pupils tend to dilate, you have more difficulty breathing, and your heart rate is faster, and you stop digesting food. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system is more active under circumstances when you are calmer. So, you're having a nice, relaxing evening with your preferred partner, and you breathe more slowly, and your heart rate slows, and your pupils constrict. We'll come back to this when we're talking about anxiety disorders in Chapter 5. Now, think about what makes us who we are. In some ways it's difficult to follow, this biological piece because it's so different from what we see. But keep in mind that what we believe is happening is that we have a number of genes that are active and working and together producing proteins that interact, and that those actions create structures in the brain with associated cognitive responses, and that those structures and cognitive responses are what lead to schizophrenia. We've talked primarily today about parts of the brain associated with certain kinds of behavioral problems. I also want you to think about not just about localization, but also mass action, how the whole brain, the whole nervous system works together to create particular kinds of problems. Just as multiple parts of our multiple genes work together, we also want to be thinking about multiple parts of the brain. Regardless, most of the interventions from a biological model's point of view is focused on medication, sometimes surgery, very rarely, and rarely electroconvulsive therapy, which is also called ECT. So, what should you do now? Try running up and down the stairs. What do you notice? Really do a scan of what's happening in your body. What you're noticing is your part is in action. And then sit and watch a candle, breathing in slowly and evenly, and breathing out. And you'll notice some changes throughout your body. Those are what part of your nervous system in action. And then read about the biological causes of any disorder that you're interested in. How do they study it? How do they explain their findings? And what suggestions for treatment do they make? And I'll see you next as we're talking about neurons and neurotransmitters.